Here's when you can buy the next PS5 add-on. Who's the biggest loser when it comes to Xbox buying Activision? And the next game in the Last of Us series just leaked. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. I hope you had a great weekend. This is the early week news update. Before I jump into all this news, I just got to do my humble YouTuber request here and ask you to help me get to 200,000 subscribers. Whether you're new here or have been watching for a while, make sure you take a second to make sure you're subscribed and also have your notifications set to all. All right, so the first news story I have for you guys today is that the PlayStation Access controller, Sony's adaptive controller that's kind of like the Xbox adaptive controller, but it's built in a completely different way. It finally has a release date and a price. So this thing, you can actually pre-order it coming up on July 21st, and it'll start shipping right at the beginning of December, and it'll cost you around $90. The actual release date is December 6th, but regardless, it kind of seems like on the surface a little bit far out from how long ago this thing was announced. But then you take a look at a picture of it and see all of the different pieces and components that come along with it, all the different configurations you can use for this controller, and you kind of understand why this thing took a little bit longer for them to create. Because even if you go back to that first trailer where they announced it, it's very clear they're using a render and not the physical product in the trailer. It's also a little bit of a niche product for Sony, so it makes sense why they'd have to price it up just a little bit. But regardless, I'm glad that both Xbox and PS5 are going to have adaptive controllers. But while you look at the Xbox controller, that is one that very clearly has a defined purpose. Just looking at this thing, the game that I think it would have the most utility in is something like Street Fighter 6. I mean, that big joystick right in the middle obviously would lend itself well to being like a fight stick, and also having all the buttons laid out around it in a perfect circle like that could be used for combos or something like that. There's a ton of versatility you could have here with this controller, so it might be worth picking up for someone even if you don't actually need to use it. But yeah, more accessibility, more ways for people to play games, that's just a net good in my opinion, and I would appreciate it if Sony would look into making sure this thing can work on PC. I saw back in January there were a lot of articles going around saying that it's not going to support PC, and we haven't actually gotten any updates on that. But yeah, this looks like a really cool controller that's really customizable, so making it available on as many platforms as possible would be sweet. It's not really going to make anyone go out and buy a PS5 over an Xbox, especially considering the Xbox has a very similar controller. So this seems like something it would be cool if Sony actually made it work on Nintendo Switch or even Xbox and PC, right? Like, make your accessibility controller available to everyone, because that's the whole point of making an accessibility controller, to make it so everyone can play your video games. I think this is going to remain a PlayStation Direct only purchasable item, but still, it's really cool that Sony made it, and now you know when you can get it. All right, so this next story is definitely a mixed bag, because while yes, it is awesome that the FTC versus Xbox story is finally looking like it's wrapping up, how things shook out for PlayStation and Xbox, there are multiple ways to look at it, but it seems like on the surface at least, that PlayStation got the short end of the stick. We'll start with the good news first though. Number one, this deal is ending. I'm really excited about that. I mean, Xbox obviously thinks the deal is about to end and they're going to get Activision, because they made a big move today where they got rid of games with gold and Xbox Live Gold. They just have a Game Pass like basic tier. I think it's called Game Pass Core. It comes with Xbox Live and a selection of 25 games from Game Pass. That's cool. It's weird because it costs $9.99 and then the next tier up is $10.99, and that's Game Pass on its own. I don't really know what the pricing structure is there or why they were holding back on this information, but making big announcements like that where you're getting rid of something where you were giving away free games, you can kind of see why they might have been sitting on this news, so they think this deal's gonna wrap up. The next piece of good news is that Call of Duty will remain on PlayStation for at least 10 years. There's a binding agreement that Sony signed. After 10 years, it seems like everything's up in the air, so this kind of puts a clock on Sony to make a competitor to Call of Duty, right? Which obviously they're doing. We just talked about this last week where they're going to invest something like $2 billion into research and development of live service games for PlayStation's brand. And while yes, that is kind of a bummer if you're like me and you like single player games, you're not really super interested in a whole bunch of live service games, it is good to know that they're going to try and combat Xbox owning Call of Duty, which is like the biggest game release every single year outside of something like, I guess, Pokemon. And that's really where the good news ends for PlayStation, because while yes, it is good for Call of Duty gamers that Call of Duty is going to stick on PlayStation for at least 10 years, there was a much better deal on the table that Jim Ryan could have taken earlier on before he decided to make this a battle of attrition and extend this whole lawsuit or whatever you want to call it way longer than it was supposed to be. And the reason I think this deal is not as good as it could have been is because this deal only applies to Call of Duty. So right now, Call of Duty has to come to PlayStation for 10 years, but every other Activision IP, whether you're talking about Spyro or Crash Bandicoot, or if you go into the depths and pull out Singularity, the awesome Wolfenstein game that was delisted from Steam a long time ago, anything Blizzard makes in the future like StarCraft 3, which just started development, Diablo 5, Overwatch 3, some form of World of Warcraft that could come to console, literally any of those are not on the table anymore for Sony because they don't get the deal that was on the table earlier. Now, the silver lining there is that Diablo 4 is not something that Blizzard is going to abandon anytime soon. They have expansions in the works. The new season starts this week. It looks like people are really enjoying the game still. I know I am. I just finished a Stronghold this morning over on my PS5 and it was super fun. So that's good to know that we're not going to give up on that game and then just immediately move into Diablo 5, which is only going to be available on Xbox. But really, if you look at Xbox right now, they are building an RPG powerhouse over there. Between Obsidian, Blizzard, Bethesda game studios, like there are a ton of huge open world RPG studios that are making really cool games right now that are not going to come to PlayStation in the future because Jim Ryan wanted to extend this deal out. On the other hand, you could say that PlayStation also is a really good RPG factory. We're talking stuff like Ghost of Tsushima, stuff like Horizon Forbidden West. We know we're getting a Monster Hunter style Horizon game in the future, and there's just a bunch of stuff we don't even know about yet, and PlayStation will probably be just fine with their first party, second party sort of relationship they have with a ton of different studios. They of course also got Final Fantasy 16 as an exclusive. The sequel to Final Fantasy 7 Remake is going to be exclusive, and definitely the third game in that series will be. A lot of people also think that Square Enix is going to be bought by Sony, and we've seen some rumors from leakers who have verified details and stuff like that. So it's not all doom and gloom here. It just sucks to know that at one point, if PlayStation took the deal that was on the table, they could have gotten every Activision Blizzard game as an agreement for at least 10 years, but now we're just stuck with Call of Duty. Thankfully, I think it's going to take at least 5 or 10 years to actually spin up some of the IP that Xbox was able to get from Activision Blizzard. You could look at that and say, well, it doesn't really seem like we would have gotten any of these games anyway, right? Like we would have seen them announced for Xbox and then they would come out after the 10-year period because of how long it's taken Xbox to even spin up a lot of the studios they bought back in like 2013, 2014, and 2015, which, you know, is good. But still, knowing that there's a better deal on the table and that we didn't get it, I can kind of see why people would be mad at Jim Ryan about this. Overall, there is a silver lining here. Competition is great for the industry, and if Xbox can't like internally create a lot of good games on their own, buying a studio who pumps out the biggest and best-selling game every year is a smart move strategically. It's also going to cause Sony to probably retaliate and buy a couple studios. It is a little bit of a letdown though for me as a lifelong PlayStation fan that one of the biggest series is going to expire eventually on PlayStation, Call of Duty, and then all of the other stuff that I've been enjoying like Diablo 4 on my PS5, I'm not going to be able to do that in the future with subsequent games in that series. But you know, you win some, you lose some. I think PlayStation knows that they have to hit back, and we'll probably hear about that news sooner rather than later. Next up here on my news list is my PS5 tip of the day, and it's how to add users to your console. So over the weekend, I had my buddy over here and we wanted to play some Diablo 4 multiplayer, but he didn't have his Steam Deck on him. So I decided to Google if I could just add him to my PlayStation 5 and then he could play my already downloaded game and then I would play on my ROG Ally and we would have a great time doing some Diablo multiplayer in the same room. All you have to do is go to the home screen of your PlayStation 5 and go up to the right corner, click on your little profile and then click switch user. Now, if you don't have another user on your console, the next option is going to be add user, and that's exactly what you're going to want to do. And this actually worked really well for us because it didn't make my console my friend's default console, but he was able to play the games I downloaded because it was my home console. So Diablo 4 was already downloaded on my PS5 and all he had to do was log into his account and boot it up and we were good to go. Now, because this is my best friend who comes over here all the time to play games, I'm just gonna leave him logged in on my PS5 because I don't know, we could play something else that way in the future. But there's also a really handy guest feature that'll make it so once that profile logs out, it's deleted from the console. So you can do this in two different ways. There's a sign in option that'll allow you to sign into the console and then download all your games and data and everything like that. And then when you log out, it'll delete that profile from the console, including the saves after they upload to the cloud. And there's another one called Quick Play where you're just a guest on the console and any save data you have is going to be deleted and you're limited to the games that are already on the console. I was thinking about when this would come in handy and I think they should just call it the You Got Games on Your Phone mode because it's like made for kids who are over at your house and maybe want to play something like, I don't know, Sackboy's Big Adventure or Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Having their save data is not really going to matter, so they can get as far as they get, and then when they leave, you can log them out. And no, none of your saves are deleted, which is great. I've had that happen before on my PlayStation Vita. I was babysitting my little cousins who are now in high school, which really sucks. This was way back when I was in college. Yeah, they deleted some saves on my Vita, one of them being Persona 4 Golden, and that really sucked. And then the third layer of this tip is for the person who might be logging in on their friend's PS5. There is a way to create a passcode so the person who you log in on, if you don't do the one that deletes after they log out, can't just go on your PlayStation Store account, buy a bunch of games, and then play them on the main account on the PS5. All you have to do is go to users and accounts and settings, choose login settings, and then select require a PS5 login passcode when you're logged into that secondary account, because obviously if you do it on the main account, it's only going to require a passcode for that main account. So this is another defense against kids, right? Like even if you make that guest account where they get to play Sackboy: A Big Adventure with the deleting save after a while when they log out, they could figure out how to switch back into your main profile. And yeah, it's good to have a passcode installed for something like that. And then if you want to delete any of these permanent profiles from your PlayStation 5, all you have to do is just stick in that users and accounts menu, and there is an option right there on the list. So yeah, not the most exciting tip in the world, but one that I think is worth knowing about. I actually used this all the time on PS4 back in junior year of college. I lived with one of my best friends, Craig, and we only had one PS4, as in I had a PS4 and he had to wait for Christmas to get his. So we had both profiles on the console, and he was playing some of the launch games on his, and he actually was logged in pretty much the entire time I had that console. I just never told him I didn't delete it, and it was out of sheer laziness. And the last news story here today is about the Last of Us franchise, which is expanding even more with yet another remaster. So on the docket, we have the Last of Us multiplayer game, we have season 2 and 3 of the TV show, and now we have a remaster of The Last of Us Part 2. This one comes from an Ironclad leaker, which is actually the composer of the Last of Us games and the TV show, Gustavo Santaolalla. I hope I said that right. I think I did. He said in a Spanish language interview that there's going to be a re-release on PS5 of The Last of Us Part 2. People are going to be able to come up to him in it, in probably Jackson at the beginning of the game, and ask him to play songs from the game or the TV show, which is kind of cool, kind of meta, and totally expected, right? Like we saw The Last of Us Part 1 come out, the third re-release of that game, I want to say, and people were kind of going back and forth on whether or not it was a worthy upgrade. Now it's definitely one where before I played it, I was a little skeptical of the pricing on it, because like, you know, we've already had The Last of Us, we had The Last of Us Remastered, and now we're getting The Last of Us Part 1 on PS5. It's called a ground up remake, and they did do some stuff with the combat to make it play a little bit more like The Last of Us Part 2, and it definitely looks really good compared to The Last of Us Part 2, but overall it just feels like how you remember The Last of Us looking back when it came out. But when you take that game getting ported to PS5, those rumors we've heard about Horizon Zero Dawn getting ported over to PS5, and then also look at all the director's cuts of PS4 games like Death Stranding and Ghost of Tsushima, it was very clear that Sony was building up to a re-release of this PS4 game for the PS5, because we've been waiting for it. The 60 FPS patch is really good, but I think a full-on remaster would go a long way. I'm just gonna be honest with you guys, I'm kind of reaching the point where I might need a little bit of a break from The Last of Us. I've mentioned a bunch of times on this channel, I play it every year around Halloween. It's one of my favorite games ever. But you know, experiencing that same story with The Last of Us Part 1 on PS5, and then seeing the exact same thing pretty much in January with the TV show, and then hearing all this news about the TV show splitting the second game into 2 seasons, now hearing these rumors that the multiplayer game isn't going to come out, or it's like basically canceled, and then now hearing about this remaster of the second game, it feels like this franchise is getting so much longevity out of 2 games and a TV show, and I feel like Sony needs to start just showing us some stuff instead of just sitting on it and letting it leak. But I don't think we're gonna have to wait too long to hear about this, because the PS5 has been out for like 2.5 years, and that is more than enough time to remaster one of the best looking and running PS4 games, right? Like it looks really good on the PS5 already. Anyway guys, that's all I have for you today. Make sure you let me know what you think down in the comments below. Remember to subscribe, set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.